to a speech, I know. But this is just a glimpse of what many lives of those living with special needs experience each day. More specifically, those who have Down syndrome have a more visible disability, which can be identified quicker and judged faster. Down syndrome is not new, but our understanding of it is a more recent development. An English physician named John Langdon Down, who the syndrome is now named after, was the first to publish an accurate description of what is now called Down syndrome. According to a blog by the National Down Syndrome Society, even though other people had previously recognized the characteristics of the syndrome, it was Down who described the syndrome as a distinct and separate entity. Moving on, it wouldn't be until nearly 100 years later that more details would come out giving more information on the syndrome. In the same blog by NDSS, it is explained how French physician Jerome Lejeune continued the work of Dr. Down and identified Down syndrome as a chromosomal condition in the year 1959. Humans who do not have Down syndrome have 46 chromosomes which are present in each cell. However, in individuals with Down syndrome, Lejeune observed 47. Thus, it was later determined that an extra partial or whole copy of chromosome 21 results in the characteristics associated with Down syndrome. So you might be thinking, okay, I didn't know all that scientific information, but why does it really matter? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because despite the great advancements in understanding Down syndrome and the science behind the disability, people who have the syndrome still are not viewed as they should be in society. If we are honest with ourselves, I think we would all admit that at least at one point in our life, maybe when we were younger, we saw someone with Down syndrome and thought to ourselves, what is wrong with that person? I know I thought that when I was younger, but God has done a great deal in my life to have a compassionate heart for those with Down syndrome, which is what I hope to share today. Those with Down syndrome are commonly identified by common physical traits, including, but not limited to, low muscle tone, small stature, an upward slant to the eyes, and a single deep crease across the center of the palm. According to the National Down Syndrome Society and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 700, or approximately 6,000 babies are born every year in the United States with Down syndrome, which makes it the most common chromosomal condition. Unfortunately, there has been a marred view of those with Down syndrome. They're considered flawed and less than the rest. A stark statistic that I was shocked by is that Europe is working to get rid of Down syndrome. On the surface, this may sound good. Great, Down syndrome is becoming less common, so I don't really see a problem with that. But it's the truth behind the idea that is shocking. Nearly every mother with a child diagnosed in utero with Down syndrome in certain countries in Europe is urged to abort their child, and most commonly choose it. Europe is paving the way for a Down syndrome-free world. So why should Christians care about this? Our core belief in Christianity is that all humans are created in the image of God. But do we truly believe this? Or do we just think that it's true for those born without developmental and intellectual disabilities? If we truly believe that 100% of humans, born and unborn, are created in the image of God, we should be willing to stand up for life. Life for those life for the born and those unborn. Life for those without disabilities and with disabilities. People with Down syndrome are often viewed as less than in life, but as God is the creator of all, it is vital that an atmosphere is created that both welcomes and loves people with this disability. So without a doubt, there are stereotypes that revolve around those who have Down syndrome and those who are personally affected by it. From the past and even to today, the world has viewed those with this disability as not normal. Stephanie Hubach, in her book, Same Lake, Different Boat, described how throughout the ages, people with disabilities have typically been, and continue to be, seen as aberrations. They are viewed as an abnormal part of life in a normal world. This is why we're often surprised by disability, because it is viewed as outside the expected. As we can see around us today, people living with Down syndrome are often made fun of and are not viewed as owning the value that people innately have as being made in the image of God. In the 1900s, the mindset towards those who had this disability was simply hostile. A blog regarding the history of Down syndrome by the National Association for Down Syndrome, or NADS, states that in the early 1900s, the majority of Down syndrome children were institutionalized shortly after birth. Parents were persuaded, usually by medical professionals, to see their own child as less than human, with needs so great they would not even be able to raise them. Think about that. Rather than being provided with information and support, the families were urged that it would simply be easier for them to just institutionalize their child. Moving into the 1960s, there was a continued lack of support and inclusion for both those with special needs and their families. In the same article, NADS further states that in the 1960s, there were no mandated programs or services for children with special needs. So many parents started programs in church basements and in other community buildings. Essentially, the Down syndrome families were the ones who started to provide support for those facing this disability and supporting one another, as many on the outside were unwilling. Thankfully, things have begun to change, and we are beginning to see greater rights and support for those with Down syndrome. So not withholding the impact of the person who is diagnosed with Down syndrome, such a diagnosis also holds a considerable impact on the family as well. Many aspects of this diagnosis may often usher in grief. As such, grief must be given time for, but it must not be the only factor. Hubach declares in her book that the life of every new baby is cause for celebration and congratulations. Yet too many families have been robbed of this normal joy when others fail to see this, seeing only the disability of the infant. She continues by sharing how Jesus is a perfect example for us, as he both mourned with those who mourned and rejoiced with those who rejoiced. She admits for all of us that it is no easy task to do both of these simultaneously. However, she declares the immense value that it holds to a family of a newborn with a disability. Furthermore, we can see how people with Down syndrome provide families a new perspective on aspects of life, such as joy and love. She said, in my interview with Mrs. Bethany Davis, who is herself a mother of a child with Down syndrome, she said, "It's just so cool to see just how happy his spirit is and what that does for other people. And what if we all walked around with that same smile and enthusiasm on our face, like what that could do for others?" Undoubtedly, when we choose to open our hearts and lives to people with special needs, we never truly know the great impact they can have on our lives and joy. Finally, families must never be left to walk the road of disability alone. Hubach offered advice in this area by simply stating that one of the greatest gifts you can give to a family grappling with disability is the willingness to just listen and be present, as they share their grief, fears, and concerns. Sadly, more often than not, families are left walking the road in the dark alone with a lack of others around who are genuinely willing to just listen and be present. We can often get comfortable in our own lives with blinders on to the realities of others around us. However, as God's church, let us ask God to open our eyes to see the needs of others around us, have a heart to care, and the ability to meet them where they are. As another reminder, Hubach continues by urging her readers to be sure that they are present that they're present for others in need, but not rushing them to arrive at such a destination. As she says, remember, rushed resolution results in resignation, and resignation is a counterfeit peace. As followers of Christ who are called to love all people as God loves, we should pursue truly helping others by meeting them where they are, and not merely where we think they should be. People who have Down syndrome often have great capacity to be active participants in the church. However, sometimes those with special needs, as well as their families, are not provided the opportunity to be actively involved in the church. Again, Hubach explained how many statistics have shown that families with special needs are significantly underrepresented in church involvement. She continued to say that many of these individuals express that the church has been inhospitable to them, either in attitude or architecture or both. However, whatever the message, intentional or unintentional, is not one of welcome, but one that implies that we can't deal with this. Now, more often than not, in the church, I would say that such things are unintentional. However, we should use this as encouragement to be intentional, to be inclusive. Moreover, churches should actively pursue those with special needs and seek to ensure that those who have Down syndrome, when able, have the opportunity to be actively involved in the church. In their blog, The 5 Stages of Changing Church Culture to Embrace Special Needs Families, Joni and Friends describes the gap between people with special needs and others. In the final stage, so to speak, Joni declares that when people with disabilities become valued, contributing members of the church, the gap has been fully closed. When people with disabilities serve, they are no longer strangers to the congregation, but friends. They're not merely people who are served, but people who serve through their presence, gifts, and abilities. What a beautiful picture to see. Rather than being kept separate, they are welcomed with open arms to be involved with others, and even to serve when they're able. Finally, due to intellectual stereotypes, even members of a church may have the idea that those with Down syndrome are not able to have the understanding of a relationship with God. However, humans with Down syndrome are able to live spiritual lives in relationship with God as well. Remember, it is by God's grace we are saved, and not merely our intellectual ability. Mrs. Hubach said it well when she considered that a person with Down syndrome may tend to learn more slowly or require things to be explained more concretely. However, that same attribute, which is defined by society as an intellectual disability, can have beautiful spiritual ramifications that put to shame those who may be more intellectually capable. One argument against people born with Down syndrome is that Down syndrome brings more pain and suffering into the world. In an interview with Brendan O'Connor on an Irish radio, Richard Dawkins, famous atheist and scientist, declared that it would be wise and sensible to choose an abortion in this circumstance, as the amount of suffering in the world probably does not go down, but probably does go up compared to having another child who didn't have Down syndrome. He declared that it would seem plausible to choose an abortion if your child was diagnosed with Down syndrome. Admittedly, having children with special needs is no easy task. However, if we face it, neither is parenting in general. On the other hand, people who have Down syndrome have great capacities to love and often change others' views on life and the disability. Amy Tracy, in her blog Through Focus on the Family, titled Raising a Child with Down Syndrome, put it well when she said that for all these parents, raising a child with Down syndrome has altered their perspectives as they watch their kids love deeply, accept others unconditionally, express great joy, show genuine concern, and generally think the best of people and situations. Even in my own experience and speaking with others who know people with Down syndrome, this rings true. Secondly, the argument has been made that people with Down syndrome do not have the ability to be contributors to society. Because of this, NADS explained how in the mid to late 1900s, children born with Down syndrome were warehoused in large state institutions. Furthermore, the lives of those living with Down syndrome were considered to be a horror. Though people who have Down syndrome may often take longer to learn certain things or have a harder time communicating, this does not mean that they are unable to be contributors to society. After all, they are humans just like everyone else. Indeed, God is able to use all people, not based on our ability, but based on His ability. Answering the question as to why God allows people to be disabled or handicapped, GodQuestions.org put it this way: God doesn't need human might or skill or fitness to accomplish His word. He can use disability and handicap just as well. He can use anyone. Remembering this truth can help handicapped believers to maintain focus on who God is. In His goodness, God does not allow things to happen that He cannot work through. His plan is greater than ours, and we must learn to remind ourselves of this. Finally, and horrifically, is the argument that those diagnosed with Down syndrome are not deserving to live. As shortly mentioned earlier, many places around the world, most specifically and prominently in Europe, are eliminating Down syndrome. In her blog titled Abortion is Leading Us to a Down Syndrome-Free World, Ann Trainer noted that Dr. Peter McParland, an obstetrician from the National Maternity Hospital, talked to the Citizens Assembly about the reality of what has happened in other countries since abortion was legalized for reasons of disability. The numbers are stark and they are utterly devastating. In Britain, 90% of babies with Down syndrome are aborted before birth. In Iceland, every single baby, or 100% of those diagnosed with Down syndrome, are aborted. There hasn't been a baby with Down syndrome born in Iceland in the past 5 years. Denmark is following suit and is expected to be Down syndrome free by the year 2030. So actress Patricia Heaton tweeted a few years ago that Iceland isn't eliminating Down syndrome. They're just killing everybody who has it, and there's a big difference. To many people, it can be easy to see flaws in those with Down syndrome. As people of God, we must be different. We must stand up for life, not merely for those without disabilities, but also for those with special needs. All people hold value to God, not just those without disabilities. As Isaiah beautifully puts it, "But now, O Lord, you are our Father, and we are the clay, and you are our potter, and we are all the work of your hand." Isaiah 64:8. God is the creator of all, and He loves all, and so we should love all too. So we began today by examining the stereotypes of those living with Down syndrome face and the history of the disability and its effect on others. We then moved on to see how Down syndrome affects not only the person diagnosed, but also the family of that person. We saw how families must never be left to walk alone, but especially as the Church of Christ, we should pursue others and love them first. Finally, we considered what the church as a body can do to further love those with Down syndrome and their families as well. As Christians, we must not ignore the needs of others around us and in our community. So let's revisit our story from the beginning. Imagine you're walking into your first day of school. A flood of emotions fill your mind. Emotions of nervousness, excitement, expectance. As you get out of the passenger side of your car, your mom smiles and waves a big smile, which you return right back to her. As you push open the doors to the huge school, everyone turns around and looks at you. You smile and wave, but this time, people do smile back. You are received with warm smiles and high fives. As your day continues at school, people do make an effort to make you feel welcome. In fact, people invite you to sit with you at lunch and to play with you during recess. As you walk past the lockers, you hear people compliment your shoes that light up when you walk. You are filled with joy. At this point, your emotions cannot truly be expressed as your mom picks you up from school with a big grin on your face that warms both your heart and hers. So what does this mean for the average person sitting in this room today? Maybe you don't know someone who has Down syndrome, and that's okay. But I ask you not to join in on jokes that are derogatory towards those with special needs. When you walk by someone in the grocery store who noticeably has special needs, remember that they are created in the image of God, that Jesus died on the cross for them too. But maybe you do know someone who has Down syndrome. Do you include them? Do you pursue loving them as God does? I would encourage you to engage with them, to be their friend, and to love them as God loves them. Remember, we love because He first loved us.
So you had said that I think it was 6,000 children are born with Down syndrome every year, and then you had also mentioned that many of them are aborted overseas. What does America, what does like the U.S. do with children who have Down syndrome? Are they encouraged to abort? Are they put in orphanages? Like what happens?
So your question is, as I stated, approximately 6,000 babies are born in the United States every year with Down syndrome. However, in Europe and overseas, oftentimes they're aborted instead. So you're asking what happens in America, basically. So I know when women are pregnant, they're often offered a test to test if your child has Down syndrome or not. I don't know if that happens in Europe, but I know that I think there's just greater awareness in America than there is overseas about Down syndrome, and I think overall there's just a different view. So that's how I answer that question. I know that there are still many children who have Down syndrome that would still be aborted in America, but I think there's just overall greater awareness and just to care for them, and so it's significantly less. Does that answer your question? Yes, Mom.
So you mentioned that churches should be more inclusive. With that said, would you suggest churches go out and minister? Should there be outreach? How would you approach CFC as we're not inclusive enough?
So your question is, should churches be a minister in their community?
Should they pursue?
Right, should they pursue ministry? I would always say that that's beneficial. I think obviously all people need Christ and all people need the love of God. And so I think there would never be like a harm in churches pursuing, even outside the church, to minister to communities of special needs and Down syndrome. Does that answer your question, or was there a second part? How would you suggest they do it? I would just, you could get a team together of people. I'm not saying your whole church, like your whole community of like 500 people needs to go march into like a building, but I think you can get like a small team of people dedicated to that ministry to do that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Alright, so you said all people need Jesus, so like what, are there any different ways we could share Jesus with Down syndrome, and if so, what are the ways that we could share Jesus with people with Down syndrome?
Can you say that one more time? It's like a little bit slower.
So you said all people need Jesus. So are there any different ways we can share Jesus and what He did for us on the cross with people with Down syndrome? And if so, what are the ways that we could share Jesus with people with Down syndrome?
Okay, so your question is there like a different way that we should share Christ and like the gospel with people who have Down syndrome versus other people? I would say to a certain extent, yes. Because, as I was saying, people with Down syndrome often do need things to be explained more concretely. Like, not all, like, the crazy, like, terms and stuff like that, I guess. But as everyone does need Jesus, like everyone else, I think really just showing them God's love and being Christ to them is good. But yeah, they just need things more explained, like more concretely, I guess, is how I'd answer your question. Any other questions? Anyone?